Hello, my name is Jonathan Lyon and I'm a Program Manager in Microsoft's Identity and Network Access Engineering team. In this session, I'm going to demonstrate why independent software vendors and developers should integrate their applications with Microsoft's Identity and Microsoft Graph. This will be a high-level presentation of the business value and integration options the Microsoft Identity platform provides. We'll also look at how easy it is to integrate your applications with the platform. So what does the Microsoft Identity platform consist of? Well, you have one portal to register all your applications, one set of authentication libraries for building web, mobile, desktop apps with all your favourite programming languages. There's a single endpoint that is standards compliant that can sign in any Microsoft identity. It also allows compatibility with third-party libraries. You also get to secure access to APIs, from Microsoft's APIs such as the Microsoft Graph and Azure API to your own APIs that you're building. This gives you the ability to authenticate any Microsoft identity, including work and school accounts, Microsoft personal accounts that are used for things like Xbox and Outlook.com, and your application can sign in external users such as customers and partners using social identities like LinkedIn and Facebook, as well as local accounts for those that don't have a social identity. And our platform supports open industry standards. So if you've already got an application today that's using, say, SAML or OAuth, it's going to be very straightforward to you to connect your application. So why integrate with the Microsoft Identity platform? Well, really there's 5 main benefits. The first is to reduce sign-in friction for both you, as the ISV developer, and for your customer. By no longer managing identities and authentication within your app, you will save time and can focus on your core product. This also lowers the cost of development. There's no building of infrastructure to store usernames and passwords. Your users will have a better experience, allowing them to use their own preferred identity to sign into their applications. And single sign-on is the key thing that our customers are asking for. They want a single identity that is provided by their organization, and they can leverage that identity across all the applications and services they use. Enhanced security. How many of you that have apps already today where you store a username and password have had your customers recently ask you for multi-factor authentication? How many of those customers are asking you about security and starting to make demands on how your app is secured? By using the Microsoft Identity platform, you and your customers will cover a large suite of security capabilities without actually making much change to your application. Because they own the identity, they can leverage the security capabilities they have already purchased as part of their Azure or Office 365 licensing. You'll also be able to leverage the Microsoft Cloud. I will cover this more often in a bit with the Microsoft Graph API, but basically you can leverage and integrate Office 365 capabilities within your application. We then can look at complying with IT. Because IT are now in control of your app, which users can use it, how they can use it with security controls, they can ensure that your app matches their IT compliance. And then the last point, of course, is coming to integration. And this is a key one for yourselves. It's very, very easy to integrate. And during this session, I'll show you the wealth of resources that makes integration easy. This is the one salesy slide I promise, and I won't go through each of these numbers, but it's safe to say we have a lot of customers, which means there's a very good chance your customers are already using Azure AD. So let's put some of these impressive numbers into a bit of context. Everyone you know that uses Office 365 has Azure Active Directory already in place. Everyone that uses Azure has Azure Active Directory. So what if your customers don't use either of those? Well, there's still a good chance they're already using Azure Active Directory. When we look at our usage numbers and take out the Microsoft first-party products, we have large numbers of Amazon Web Services and Google customers using Azure AD as their identity provider for those products. And we also have thousands of third-party SaaS applications already using Azure Active Directory as an identity provider. So there really is a good chance that your customers are using this. When you look at stuff like Microsoft Teams, for example, with the recent COVID situation, Teams usage now is in the millions of daily active users. All of those users are using Azure Active Directory. So they will be able to use single sign-on with your application. So let's just talk quickly about Azure Active Directory. So typically Azure Active Directory comes in two forms. One is Azure Active Directory Cloud and the other is hybrid. So Azure Active Directory Cloud is where an organization has a cloud-first approach. All their identities are in Azure Active Directory and they use that throughout their life cycle. So they can have third-party HR apps such as Workday automatically provisioning users from their Workday platform. IT can then see those users, they can assign permissions, group memberships, provide access to applications and the demands of the business. A hybrid model is very similar, but the difference is it starts from on-prem, where an organization has Active Directory, which we're all very familiar with, and they synchronize those identities up into the cloud. Again, they can still use products like Workday for automatic provisioning, and they can then still use Azure Active Directory for authentication for those cloud-based applications like Office 365, Salesforce, Dropbox. So it really provides a very simple mechanism for organizations to have single sign-on both on-premise and in the cloud. One identity that can access everything. That identity lifecycle can be managed by a third-party solution. IT can put security controls around that identity and the applications and resources it works on. So it provides a true enterprise identity platform. And basically, we can ensure that business processes are always up to date, user information is correct, permissions are correct. So it provides a secure platform for controlling access to valuable data and resources. A part of Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, is external identities. And this is one of the most commonly asked questions we get from developers is, what is external identities? What is B2C? What is B2B? And which of those should I be using for my app? So Microsoft Azure Active Directory External Identities is a set of capabilities that lets you share your resources or apps with users outside of your organization. And there are two main reasons why you might need to connect with external users. And this links us nicely to the B2B, B2C piece. So sharing Azure Active Directory apps and resources for collaboration. In this scenario, you can invite external users into your tenant, your Azure Active Directory, as guest users that you can then assign permissions while letting them still come in using their existing credentials. And I'll show an example of this in a second. We've now even added capabilities for self-service sign-up and federation flows, so you can actually start providing a better experience for external users requesting access to your apps and resources. This is very much a B2B or business to business scenario. The other scenario is where you want to scale your apps to consumers, customers and citizens. And this is the Azure AD B2C or business to consumer. If you're creating consumer facing apps, you can use Azure AD as your directory and identity system for consumers who can then sign in with the identity they've already established. For example, LinkedIn or Facebook. You can fully customize the control of the user experience for them signing up to access the application, signing into the application, and even managing their user profile. The difference here is with Azure Active Directory, when you build an application, you're not providing an identity store. You are basically setting your application to work with Azure Active Directory, and therefore the authentication all happens there. With B2C, what we're doing is we're providing you an identity platform and a B2C tenant. And what happens there is you then decide which identity providers you want to federate with. So when I come to access your application as a consumer, I would come and I would sign up to use your service. And when I do that, you can provide a number of identity providers I can select from, and I can go, oh, I already have a Facebook, so I will use that one. And then you basically store a bit of information around that user that you can leverage within your application. But the authentication always happens with Facebook. I hit your B2C instance, that redirects to Facebook, that authenticates me, brings me back to B2C, and then into your application. Now, Azure Active Directory is licensed per user. There's a free tier and then a couple of premium tiers. And you'll find most of your customers have already got premium capabilities as part of their Office 365 or M365 licensing. For external identities, we have a single billing model, which is based on monthly active users. This is the count of unique users with authentication activity within a calendar month. So let's look at that B2B example in a little bit more detail, just to make sure we're clear on that scenario. Here we have a user from Fabricam, and they are in their own tenant. We also have the Contoso tenant, and they have an application that is a SaaS application that they've been using, but they need a guest from Fabricam to be able to use that application. Maybe it's a contractor, or maybe they're partnering on an initiative. What Contoso can do is invite that user as a guest, and then they can set permissions to say that guest user can access the application. In that scenario, the Fabricam user uses their Fabricam credentials for authentication, but authorization happens in Contoso. So why is this important? Well, when you're developing applications, this will be a very common scenario within your customers. So it's worth being aware that this will happen. Now, when your application gets an authentication token from Contoso, it'll say, here's a Contoso user, here's some information, and they're authenticated, they can use your app. When a Fabricam guest user comes and accesses your application, it's exactly the same process. As far as you're concerned, it's a user coming from Contoso. You don't need to know that they've authenticated from Fabricam, because your application is licensed to Contoso and Contoso are using it. The other reason we mention B2B is because sometimes developers fall in a trap of spooling up an Azure Active Directory tenant and inviting lots of different customers to that tenant and using that as the identity for their application. And that's not its intention. So when we're trying to decide whether it's Azure AD or B2C, there's really a key question to ask, and that is, who is your audience? Who are the people accessing your app, and who are they acting as? If they're a consumer, a customer, perhaps you don't even know they exist yet, that's very much a B2C scenario. If you're building an application for a SMB, small to medium-sized business, or an enterprise organization, they would have Azure Active Directory. So you would leverage Azure Active Directory as the identity platform. So now let's look at some scenarios and what's the right solution for them. So this is the first one. I want to provide secure, seamless access with single sign-on to my employees using their business IDs. So this is what we commonly known as a line of business application. It's a single tenanted app. It's built for a organization and they will use it. And the right identity solution for this is Azure Active Directory. This way they can use their corporate IDs to access the application and get that single sign-on. As you can see from the slide, They can still leverage B2B and invite guests in and give them access to the application, but it's a single tenant app built for that organization. So the next scenario is very similar. I want single sign-on, but I'm building a SaaS application, and it's for small to medium-sized businesses, enterprises, and I want them to use their own corporate credentials, their business IDs to access the application. Again, this is where Azure Active Directory sits in. You can configure your application to use Azure AD, and no matter what Azure Active Directory comes in, they can authenticate and give you an ID and an access token. You will then do the authorization to say, yes, they're licensed, or yes, they're allowed in to do the application, but it means you don't need to manage the identities, you don't need to manage usernames and passwords. You can simply let the authentication happen within Azure Active Directory. You still get to see who the user is. You will get an ID token as part of that authentication process, which will give you valuable information like their name, their user principal name, their email address, the tenant they came from, for example. So in this scenario, I want to provide simple, reliable and secure single sign-on to customer-facing apps, social accounts, and potentially even business IDs. So here I have an application, and I don't know who my users are potentially. They're more general public. This is where B2C sits in. I can create customized user flows, including a sign-up process where they can come and they can register for an account. And when they do that, they can select the identity that they want to use to authenticate with that application. And there's a multitude of them available. Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Amazon, Twitter, the list goes on. And you can even use pretty much any identity provider out there that uses OpenID as a protocol standard. If they don't have any identities, because B2C is an identity platform in its own right, you can also create local users. So therefore they could create a local B2C account. Now that does mean you store the username and password within B2C, but B2C out of the box provides a self-service password reset and profile editing features, so you can provide a mechanism for them to manage their account. You can also put security controls in. So if you want to force MFA on your app, you can do that with B2C. Bearing in mind, with the Azure Active Directory, you put in the onus on the customers to configure their MFA on the applications that they want to secure and the conditions they want to secure. But I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail next. And then the final scenario is all of the above. I want my apps to be accessed by customers, partners, and also employees. That's not a problem at all, because you can actually use Azure Active Directory and B2C side by side. So in this scenario, we have Woodgrove Groceries. We have a simple sign-up page here where we've got three personas. One is, I'm an individual customer. I want to go online, order my groceries for home delivery. In this scenario, you don't know who I am. So I will sign up and I can then choose the identity provider of my choice to do the authentication. So for example, LinkedIn or Facebook. But what if there's a business that comes in? Maybe they want to order a load of fruit for fruit bowls around the office, and they're doing it on behalf of their company. Again, B2C could be set up to work with those corporate identities. So they could actually come in, they could sign up to B2C and use their Azure Active Directory to provide single sign-on as a business customer, and then they can order their fruit for the office. Then we come to the partner situation. So these are the suppliers, the farmers that are providing the produce. You might need to give them access to the back-end side of the application, so they can actually help with stock and orders processing. Here's where, if they've got Azure Active Directory, you could set up a B2B relationship and allow them to sign in using their corporate credentials as a business partner. So really, it doesn't matter what your scenario is, Azure Active Directory and the Microsoft Identity Platform can cater for it. So let's look now at how your app can be integrated with Azure Active Directory. As I mentioned earlier, our platform supports open industry standards. So if you've already got an existing application and it's using SAML or OAuth, it's really straightforward to connect your application with very little changes. If you're building a new application, then we highly recommend looking at OpenID and OAuth. It's the latest standard in authentication protocols. It has a simpler model for authentication, which means it's easier for customers to onboard. When you look at SAML, you have to share signing certificates and URLs in order to get SAML working as a relationship. With OpenID Connect, you don't have to do that, so it's easier for customers to onboard. You can also, with OpenID and OAuth, leverage APIs, including your own and third-party, such as the Microsoft Graph. But of course, the choice is yours. We support both protocol standards. With our Microsoft Authentication libraries, often referred to as MSOL, we've made adding authentication into your apps really easy. We provide documentation, videos, reference code, samples and walkthroughs for a wide range of languages. So no matter what your application is built on, you should be able to get integration into Azure AD up and running really quickly.